The cold steel of the handgun was pressed directly against the back of her head, and Prestige Baker didn't flinch. Not when the masked assailant burst through the door. Not when the patron scrambled toward the linoleum in a frantic wave of panic. Not when the voice behind the mask cracked under the weight of a desperate Tuesday morning. She simply leaned forward, resting her arms casually on the counter, as if the lethal threat inches from her skull was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. In the shadows of the corner booth, a man in a tailored suit went rigid. He didn't look at the gun, he looked at her. Because he knew that voice, the hauntingly steady tone of a ghost he had carried for years, and it was the only reason he was still breathing. Rain drummed against the diner windows, washing the world in a blur of cold gray and flickering neon. Inside, Prestige Baker was behind the counter, her hair pulled into a tight, efficient bun, her white and blue uniform signaling a routine that was about to be shattered. The gun entered the room first. The mundane world collapsed instantly. A driver in booth 3 hit the floor. An old man froze with a cup halfway to his mouth as the hot liquid spilled over his trembling fingers. Prestige didn't move. She watched the gunman with a look of quiet defiance and analytical curiosity, her body language remaining perfectly controlled. "You picked the wrong diner," she said, her voice so calm it made the air feel heavy. The words were delivered with the flat certainty of a woman who had seen the floor fall out beneath her too many times to be afraid. In the corner, Shujun slowly set his cup down without a sound. He had spent 7 years building an empire out of ruthless calculations and white-knuckle control. But nothing in his world of blood and loyalty had ever destabilized him like the sound of her composure. Because once, when he was a man standing on the edge of disappearing forever, she was the one who told him to wait until morning, and now somehow he had found her. The metal of the gun was cold against Prestige's skin, but she didn't move. She didn't drop to the floor like the truck driver in booth 3 or the college students by the window. Instead, she leaned her weight onto the counter, looking at the masked man with a flat, bored stare. "Empty the register," he screamed. His voice was thin, cracked with a desperation that smelled like amateur hour. Prestige didn't reach for the cash. She noticed the way his gloved hand was vibrating, the barrel of the pistol tracing erratic circles in the air. "You're sweating," she said. Her voice was a low, steady hum that cut through his hysterics. "If your finger slips because of that sweat, you aren't a thief anymore. You're a murderer. Is that worth the $100-something bucks in this drawer?" The gunman blinked, his posture faltering. He had expected screams, not a clinical evaluation of his failure. "Shut up! Just give me the money!" "It's Tuesday morning in a rainstorm," she continued, her tone as dry as a desert. "We haven't had a rush. You're risking 20 years for less than $200. You should leave before the cops, who are usually 2 blocks over at the bakery right now, decide they want a coffee." In the corner booth, June sat perfectly still. He wasn't looking at the robber. He was staring at Prestige. He recognized the way she didn't perform fear. He remembered that same unwavering tone from 7 years ago, back when he was the one falling apart and she was the only thing holding the world steady. The robber looked at the register, then at the door, and finally at the woman who seemed more like a judge than a victim. The power in the room had shifted entirely. "The drawer's opening," Prestige said softly, her hand moving toward the keys. "Decide if you're running with the cash or running for your life." The gunman didn't wait to find out. He turned and bolted out into the rain, the bell above the door chiming a lonely, mocking sound in his wake. As the other patrons began to sob or gasp from the floor, Prestige simply picked up a rag and started wiping a smudge off the counter. Across the room, June finally set his coffee down. He had found her. June didn't move as the door's sound faded into the sound of heavy rain. He sat in the corner booth, his hand still wrapped around a ceramic mug that had gone cold. Around him, the diner was exhaling. The truck driver scrambled up, swearing under his breath, and the college students began to sob with the high-pitched release of adrenaline. But June's world had narrowed to the woman behind the counter. From the back, she looked unremarkable. Just a slender figure in a white dress with blue trim. But it was the bun that held his attention. It was pulled back with precision, tight and intentional. He watched her pick up a fallen napkin, her movements fluid and devoid of the tremors currently racking every other person in the room. She was already resetting the stage, erasing the violence as if it were nothing more than a spilled drink. 7 years. He closed his eyes for a second, and the smell of the diner grease was replaced by the salt-heavy air of a bridge over the Han River. He remembered the weight of his own body leaning against the railing, the crushing realization that he had lost everything: his family, his name, his dignity. He had been a ghost in a cheap suit, ready to let the water take the rest of him. Then a voice had cut through the wind. It hadn't been soft or sweet. It had been exactly like it was today: analytical, steady, unbreakable. "The water is cold," she had said back then, standing there with a paper bag of groceries. And you haven't even finished your coffee yet. Seems like a waste of a good cup." She hadn't tried to save his soul. She had just grounded him in the mundane until the urge to jump passed. She had seen him at his absolute lowest and treated him like a man who simply needed to finish his drink. June opened his eyes. He was no longer that broken boy. He was a man who commanded hundreds, a man whose name was now respected in the back rooms of Seoul and the high-rises of Manhattan. He had built a fortress of power to ensure he would never be that vulnerable again. Yet hearing her voice today, the way she had dismantled a gunman with nothing but a few sentences, made him remember. She turned then, her gaze sweeping the room to check on the patrons. For a fleeting moment, her eyes met his. There was no spark of recognition in her expression, only that same quiet, calculating curiosity. To her, he was just another customer in a suit, perhaps a little too still, perhaps a little too intense. He realized then that while he had carried her voice like a talisman through 7 years of blood and betrayal, he was a stranger to her. She was the hidden operative of this mundane world, a woman whose internal resilience was her greatest weapon, and she had no idea she had just saved the same man twice. June didn't approach her. He didn't offer a word of thanks. He simply reached into his pocket, left $100 bill tucked under the rim of his cold coffee cup, and stood up. He had work to do. He needed to find out why a woman with her skill set was wasting away in a rain-soaked diner. And more importantly, he needed to find a way to pay back a debt that had been accruing interest for 7 long years. By the time Prestige finished her shift, the world had already claimed her. She didn't know it yet. She was too busy counting the meager tips from the traumatized patrons who had stayed to give statements. She walked home through the drizzle, her mind already moving to the next task: dinner for her brother Leo. She pushed open the door to their apartment, the smell of damp carpet and old wood greeting her. Leo was hunched over his phone on the sofa, the blue light washing out his young face. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't ask how her day was. He just turned the screen toward her. "Is this you?" he asked, his voice a mix of awe and terror. Prestige set her bag down and looked. It was a grainy, high-angle shot from the diner's security feed. There she was, leaning over the counter, the muzzle of the gun a black dot against her hair. The caption read, "The coldest waitress in the world." The view count was climbing in real time. 200,000. 300,000. The comments section was a war zone of speculation. Some called her a hero, others called her a sociopath. A few wondered what she was hiding. "The guy was shaking, Leo," she said, her voice flat as she headed toward the kitchen. "It wasn't a movie. It was just a mess." "But you didn't move," Leo persisted, following her into the small kitchen. "Everyone else was under the tables and you just talked to him. People are calling you the Ice Queen." Prestige opened the fridge. Half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, and a wilted head of lettuce. The viral fame felt like a heavy weight pressing on the back of her neck, more intrusive than the gunman's weapon. She was a woman who had built her life on the power of being overlooked. Invisibility was her armor. It was the only way she had kept the two of them safe after their parents' lives had ended in a flurry of debt and bad decisions. Now that armor was shattered. "It doesn't matter," she said, though. "Fame doesn't pay the rent. Go wash up. I'm making omelets." She stood at the stove, the blue flame of the burner hissing. She was the emotional center of this house, the pillar that couldn't crack. If she showed fear, Leo would fall apart. If she showed exhaustion, he would worry. So she remained the Ice Queen, cracking eggs with a steady hand, while her phone, buried in her bag, web vibrated incessantly with notifications from strangers and news outlets. The silence in the apartment was heavy. It was the silence of a woman who had spent years making herself small, only to be dragged into the light by a 20-second clip of a Tuesday morning robbery. She looked at the small kitchen window, watching the rain blur the streetlights outside. She had survived the gunman, but as she watched the view count on Leo's phone hit 500,000 from the other room, she realized the real danger was just beginning. In her world, being noticed was the first step toward being destroyed. And across the city, the man in the corner booth was watching that same video, his eyes fixed on the way she didn't flinch, already planning how to bring her out of the shadows. The bell above the diner door didn't sound with its usual cheer the next morning. It sounded like a warning. Prestige arrived for her shift at 6 a.m., but the door was already locked. Through the glass, she saw Sal, the owner, sitting at the counter. He wasn't prepping the grill or checking the inventory. He was staring at a tablet, the blue light of the viral video reflecting in his glasses. When he finally let her in, he didn't look her in the eye. "I can't have you here, Prestige," he said. He gestured vaguely at the street. There were 3 news vans out there at dawn. People are calling. Reporters are asking about our liquor license, our payroll, our everything. Prestige stood by the coat rack, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I didn't ask for the video, Sal. I was just doing my job." "Your job was to be a waitress, not a folk hero," Sal snapped, finally looking up. His face was flushed. "This place survives on being noticed. You brought a spotlight. I've got people who pay me to stay invisible, and they're unhappy, very unhappy." He reached under the counter and pulled out a plain white envelope. He slid it across the formica. 2 weeks' pay, plus a little extra. Just don't come back. I already called the afternoon girl to cover." Prestige didn't argue. She simply picked up the envelope, tucked it into her bag, and walked to the back break room. Her locker was small, the metal dented and scratched. Inside, her spare uniform hung on a plastic hanger. She took it down. Slowly, she began to fold it. She smoothed out the wrinkles in the white fabric. She tied the apron strings into a perfect, tight knot, then folded the entire garment into a neat square. Most people, fired after staring down a gun for their boss, would have thrown the uniform in the trash or left it crumpled on the floor. But Prestige Baker didn't live her life in crumples. She lived in the margins. And in the margins, you kept your tools sharp and your presentation clean. It was the only dignity the world couldn't take from her. She placed the folded uniform on the bench, shut the locker door, and walked out. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the rain had stopped, leaving the city wet. She felt the weight of the envelope in her bag. It was enough to buy them a week, maybe 2, if she skipped meals. But the invisibility that had been her shield was gone. She walked past a news crew setting up across the street, her head down, her pace steady. She looked like just another woman in a rush, someone society would overlook. But as she rounded the corner, she caught her reflection in a shop window. For the first time, she saw what the world saw. A woman who didn't break. She didn't know that 3 blocks away, a black sedan was idling, the man inside watching her through tinted glass. Her world was collapsing, but as she smoothed her hair back into its efficient bun, she didn't look like a woman who was falling. She looked like a woman waiting for the next move. 7 years ago, the rain in Seoul had been colder. He stood on the Mapo Bridge, his fingers numb as they gripped the wet railing. Behind him, the city hummed with a life he no longer possessed. His father's business had been gutted by rivals, his family name dragged through the dirt, and his bank account held exactly $40, the price of a final meal or a modest headstone. He had been staring into the dark swirl of the Han River for 20 minutes when a shadow stopped beside him. "It's a long drop," a voice said. It wasn't soft or filled with pity. It was matter of fact. June didn't look up. "I know. The water is at its highest tonight," she continued. She was leaning against the railing next to him, a paper bag of groceries balanced on her hip. She wore a worn-out coat and a scarf pulled high against the wind. "If you jump now, you'll be 5 miles downstream before anyone even notices you're gone. It's efficient, I suppose." June finally turned his head. He saw a young woman with a face, stoic, unreadable, and startlingly calm. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like someone who understood exactly how much the world could hurt. "Why do you care?" June asked, his voice cracking. "I don't," she replied, pulling a steaming paper cup of coffee from her bag. She held it out to him. "But I hate to see good coffee go to waste. And you look like you haven't felt anything warm in a long time." June hesitated, then took the cup. The heat seeped into his frozen palms, grounding him. He took a sip. It was cheap, bitter, and the best thing he had ever tasted. "Wina, there's a diner 2 blocks away," she said, looking out at the water. "They're hiring a dishwasher. It's back-breaking work, and the pay is an insult, but they provide a meal at the end of every shift. $40 can get you a room for 3 nights if you know where to look. By then, you'll have your first paycheck." She began to walk away, her boots clicking against the pavement. "Wait," June called out. "Why are you helping me?" She stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm not. I'm just giving you the facts. The bridge will still be here tomorrow. You might as well see what the morning looks like first." She disappeared into the fog, leaving him with a warm cup of coffee and a choice. June didn't jump. He went to the diner. He took the job. And he used that $40 to survive until he could start building the empire that would eventually burn his enemies with. He had spent 7 years searching for that voice, the only thing that had reached him when he was a ghost. Now sitting in his car outside her apartment building, June touched the scar on his palm from that cold night on the bridge. Prestige Baker had forgotten the stranger she saved, but June had built his entire life on the foundation of her 40-cent cup of coffee. He wasn't just offering her a job. He was finally answering the woman who had told him to wait for the morning. The morning after June's visit, the apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of things left unsaid. Prestige sat at the small kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen. It remained stubbornly black. No, like it had finally given up, a casualty of a 3-year-old machine that had been on its last legs since she bought it refurbished. She reached for her phone to check her email. No new messages, no interview requests. Just another news notification featuring a still frame of her face from the robbery. She was a hero to the internet, but in the real world, she was a woman who couldn't afford to fix a power cord. Leo came into the kitchen, his movements quiet, almost apologetic. He reached for a bowl, but his eyes stayed on the floor. "I can walk to school today, Press," he said. "Save the bus fare." "It's raining again, Leo. You'll get soaked." "I don't mind." He turned to grab his backpack, and that was when she saw it. As he lifted his foot, the flap of the left sole dangled like a broken jaw. Thus, the cardboard he'd stuffed inside to block the cold was soggy and gray, peeling away in wet strips. He tried to tuck his foot back quickly, but it was too late. Prestige felt a sharp, cold ache in her chest. She was the Ice Queen, the woman who didn't flinch, yet watching her brother try to hide his poverty from her felt like a slow-motion execution. "Leo," she whispered. "It's fine," he snapped, his voice cracking with the sudden, sharp pride of a boy forced to grow up too fast. "I'll just put more tape on it. It's just shoes, Prez. We're fine." But they weren't fine. The fridge was a wasteland of condiments and half-empty jars. The yellow eviction notice sat on the counter, a silent countdown to homelessness. She had $34 in her bank account and a brother who was literally walking on the ground. She watched him limp toward the door, trying to walk flat-footed to keep the sole from clicking. When the door clicked shut, Prestige didn't cry. She didn't have the luxury of tears. They were a waste of energy she needed for survival. She looked at the business card June had left. It was still sitting on the table, the heavy cream paper looking absurdly expensive against the chipped wood. Yon, Midtown. She thought about the bridge in Seoul. She had told him to wait for the morning. Now, 7 years later, her own morning had arrived, and it was bleak and cold. She picked up the laptop and tried the power button one last time. Nothing. The silence of the apartment was absolute. She looked at the card again. She had spent her life avoiding men like June, men who traded in power and secrets. But as she looked at the duct tape residue on the floor where Leo had stood, she realized she no longer had the right to be proud. She was the emotional center, the one who stayed calm while everyone else hid. But composure couldn't buy a pair of sneakers. She tucked the card into her pocket and began to put on her coat. The Ice Queen had one move left. Prestige stared at the heavy envelope on the hallway table. She didn't open it until she heard the downstairs door click shut and the engine of a car fade away. Inside was $5,000 in crisp hundreds, more money than she had seen in a long time. "Who was that, Press?" Leo asked, creeping toward the door. "A mistake," she whispered, tucking the money into her waistband. "Go get your coat. We're going to the mall." The look on Leo's face when she bought him 2 pairs of sturdy, high-top sneakers and a winter jacket that actually fit was the only thing that kept her from turning back. She watched him walk without a limp, his new soul silent on the floor. She spent the rest of the night paying the back rent and the electric bill online, watching her balance settle into a fragile safety. But the debt to June felt heavier than the poverty. She spent Sunday night staring at the cream-colored business card. She knew how men like June operated. A job was never just a job. It was leverage. It was a way to own someone's silence or their soul. She had spent 7 years running from the kind of people who made the world bleed, yet here she was, the Ice Queen, bought and paid for by a man who remembered a cup of coffee she had long since forgotten. Monday morning, she dressed in her sharpest black slacks and a white button-down. She pulled her hair back into the same efficient bun, tighter than usual. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman going to war, not to a shift. A car was waiting at the curb at 7:45 a.m. The driver didn't speak. He simply opened the door and drove her to Midtown, stopping in front of a building that looked like a sleek, windowless fortress. "Second floor," the driver said. Prestige stepped out and entered the building. The elevator opened directly into Yon. It was a space of dark wood and low lighting, where every table was spaced for secrets. It was beautiful, expensive. June was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city. He didn't turn around when the elevator sounded. "You came," he said. "I paid my rent," Prestige replied, stepping into the room. No, she didn't look at the decor. She looked at his back. "Now tell me what you actually want from me. I don't serve food to people like you for $5,000. June turned. He looked at her, not at the waitress, but at the woman who had saved him. "I want you to manage this place," he said. "The staff, the guests, the unpleasantness that happens when powerful people drink too much. I need someone who doesn't blink when things gets loud. I need the woman from the bridge." "That woman is dead," Prestige said flatly. "She died with her parents." "No." June stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "She just got better at hiding. You have a gift, Prestige. You make people wonder if they're the ones in danger. I'm just giving you a bigger stage." Prestige looked around the empty, opulent restaurant. It was a golden cage, but it had a lock she knew how to pick. "One rule," she said. "My brother never sees this world. He stays in school, he stays clean, and you stay away from him." June nodded once. "Deal." Prestige walked past him toward the bar, picking up a cloth. She didn't wait for an orientation. She began to wipe down the counter, her movements as controlled as they had been at the diner. The Ice Queen had a new throne, and for the first time in 7 years, she wasn't running. She was waiting. Prestige didn't start working. She dropped the rag on the bar and walked straight up to June until she was standing deep in his personal space. The height difference was there, but she didn't look up. She made him look down. $5,000, she said. June didn't blink. "A sign of good faith." "It's a leash." She pulled a small ledger from her bag and set it on the table between them. She had already calculated the interest. "I'm keeping a record. Every cent of that $5,000 plus the cost of the car ride this morning is being deducted from my salary. I don't work for you to be grateful. I work to be even." June leaned back against the window, watching her with an amused curiosity. "Most people in your position would just say thank you." "Most people want to be saved," Prestige countered. "I just want to be left alone." Men like you don't give gifts, June. You give loans. And I've spent my whole life watching people like my father drown because they thought a hand reached out to them was an act of God instead of a contract. June's expression hardened. "I told you why I'm doing this. The bridge, the coffee. It wasn't a business transaction. It was to me," she snapped. "I was a waitress serving a customer who looked like he was about to make a mess on my sidewalk. That's it. If you've spent 7 years turning that into a fairy tale, that's your problem, not mine." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. I know what you are. I see the way the driver looks at you. I see the way this building is wired. You're a man who buys things so he can control them. But you can't buy me. You can rent my time. You can use my composure to keep your high society thugs from killing each other over appetizers. But the second I've paid back that $5,000, the debt is dead. Do we have an understanding? June stayed silent for a long beat, his eyes scanning her face as if looking for a crack in the ice. He found nothing. No fear, no greed, just a woman who had priced her soul and found it wasn't for sale. You're right, June said finally. It is a contract. You manage Jan, you handle the guests, you keep the peace. In exchange, I provide the salary and the safety. And the distance, she added. And the distance. Prestige nodded once. The matter settled. She turned on her heel and headed back to the bar. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. She had set the price. Ora and June realized that the woman he'd been searching for was more dangerous than the enemies he'd killed to find her. The bar stock is low on the top shelf, she called out over her shoulder, already back to work. If we're opening at 6, I need the keys to the cellar. June watched her for a moment longer, then tossed a heavy ring of keys onto the counter. They slid across the wood and stopped exactly where she was standing. She picked them up. The confrontation was over. The work had begun. The apartment was silent. Saturday night usually meant the distant sound of sirens and the hum of the refrigerator, but tonight, the silence felt heavy. The yellow envelope sat on the kitchen counter. Prestige didn't need to open it to know what was inside. It was the final notice, the one that preceded the locksmith and the sidewalk. She looked at the trash can, then at the bedroom door where Leo was sleeping in a bed that wouldn't be theirs by Tuesday. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the cream-colored business card. Yawn. She walked to the window. Down in the street, the black sedan was gone, but the impression of it remained. June wasn't a man who waited forever. He was a man who knew exactly when the pressure would become unbearable. Prestige looked at her reflection in the dark glass. Her hair was down, messy, and for the first time in years, she looked tired. She could keep her pride and lose the roof over Leo's head, or she could take the job and lose her invisibility. There was no third option. She picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. The Ice Queen didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a soldier surrendering to a superior force. But she thought of the new shoes in Leo's room and the empty fridge. She dialed the number. It didn't even finish the first ring before he picked up. Yes, June said. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded like a man who had already won. The job, Prestige said. Her voice was flat, a dead horizontal line. Just the job. Nothing else. No favors, no history, no more envelopes. Just the job, June replied. Prestige hung up without saying another word. She dropped the phone on the table and picked up the yellow envelope. She tore it in half, then into quarters, and let the pieces fall into the bin. Survival had won. Defiance was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. She walked to the bathroom, turned on the cold water, and began pulling her hair back into a bun so tight it hurt. She had a shift at 8. The Ice Queen was going to Midtown. Prestige walked into Jan at 7:55 a.m. The space was a cathedral of glass and dark oak, silent and smelling of nothing but expensive air. She didn't look at the art. She didn't marvel at the view. She walked straight to the back where the staff was lined up. Men in crisp blacks who looked like they knew how to handle a knife for more than just cooking. They stared. She stared back. I'm Prestige Baker, she said. Her voice carried to every corner of the room, flat and immovable. I run the floor. If you have a problem with that, tell me now so I can find someone who doesn't. No one spoke. June emerged from the shadows of the upper balcony. He watched her from above, his hands resting on the railing. He looked for a sign of hesitation or a flicker of the girl from the bridge. He found a professional. She looked up, her gaze locking onto his. There was no gratitude in her eyes. There was no history. Keys, she said. June signaled to a man in the corner. A heavy brass set was placed in her hand. She then turned to the staff. Open the cellar. Check the inventory against the manifest. I want a briefing on tonight's VIP list in 10 minutes. She moved through the restaurant. She reorganized the bar, corrected the table settings, and dismissed a waiter whose hands were shaking. By noon, the power dynamic had shifted. June was the owner, but prestige was the law. At sunset, June walked down the stairs and stopped by the bar. He placed a new phone on the counter, unbreakable, encrypted, and already paid for. For the job, he said. Prestige didn't touch it. Deduct it from my first check. June looked at her for a long beat. You saved my life. Prestige. I sold you a coffee, she corrected, finally looking at him. And now I'm making sure your guests don't bleed on the carpet. Let's not make it more than it is. She turned back to the ledger. The Ice Queen was back in the margins, but this time the margins were made of gold. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer prey. She was exactly what June had paid for, the only person in the room who wasn't afraid of the monsters. The doors opened. The first guests arrived. Prestige smoothed her apron, checked her bun in the mirror, and stepped into the light. It was just a job, and she was going to be the best at it.